Welcome, dear viewers, to a journey through one of the most turbulent and dramatic chapters in modern history. Today we dive into the rise of fascism in Italy, a story not only about one man's ambition, but also about a nation's struggle, its wounds after the Great War, and the dangerous allure of power when hope turns into desperation. This video will guide you through the streets of post-war Italy, where poverty and chaos gave birth to radical ideas. You will meet figures who shaped destiny, hear the echo of voices that demanded order at any cost, and witness the tragic transformation of democracy into dictatorship. As we unfold this story, you will see how Benito Mussolini, once a socialist agitator, reinvented himself as Il Duce, the leader who promised to restore Italy's pride, but dragged it into darkness. This is not just a history lesson, it is a warning. The shadows of the past remind us that when fear and anger overpower reason, the path to tyranny is paved. Stay with us until the end, and you will understand not only what happened in Italy, but why it matters today. Imagine a nation betrayed by victory, where soldiers return from the trenches only to find hunger, riots, and despair. A nation promised glory, but handed humiliation. Now imagine a voice rising above the chaos, a voice that promises discipline, pride, and a reborn empire. The crowd cheers, the flags wave, and the future feels certain. But behind that promise lies violence, censorship, and war. This is the story of how Italy traded freedom for the illusion of greatness. Subscribe for more history, like and comment if you believe history should never be forgotten, and share to spark conversation about the lessons we must learn from the past. This is not myth. This is history, and it begins here. The year is 1918. The First World War has ended, and Italy stands among the victors. But victory feels hollow. Instead of glory, Italians see hunger, broken promises, and a nation on the edge of collapse. Soldiers march home, not to parades or prosperity, but to shattered towns and empty factories. Fields lie abandoned, industry is paralyzed, and millions of families wait anxiously for loved ones who will never return. Italy had fought alongside the Allies with the hope of becoming a great power, of expanding its borders and fulfilling the dream of a Mare Nostrum, a Mediterranean empire to rival Rome. Yet the spoils of victory are meager. The treaties grant Italy only part of what was promised, leaving nationalists furious and soldiers feeling betrayed. This bitter disillusionment is called the mutilated victory. The people's suffering deepens. Inflation eats away at wages, food is scarce, and returning veterans cannot find jobs. Strikes and protests spread across cities. In the countryside, peasants seize land, desperate for survival. Everywhere, anger smolders. And in this turmoil, new voices rise, voices that promise order, strength, and revenge. For many Italians, democracy now seems weak, unable to protect them or provide for their future. They begin to look for someone stronger, someone who can restore Italy's pride. The stage is set. Out of chaos, a new ideology will be born. From the ruins of victory, fascism will rise. The end of World War I was supposed to bring Italy honor, land, and recognition. Instead, it brought bitterness. The Italian people called it the Vittoria Mutilata, the mutilated victory. When Italy entered the war in 1915, the Allies promised territorial rewards in the Treaty of London. Italy expected South Tyrol, Trentino, Alto Adige, Istria, Dalmatian Islands, and Dalmatian coastlines, and even colonial lands to build a greater empire. Italian leaders spoke of a new Roman destiny, a Mediterranean dominance that would echo the Caesars. But when the war ended, the victorious Allies betrayed those promises. Italy received South Tyrol, Trentino, and Istria, but not Dalmatia, not the colonies, not the sweeping gains they had been promised. Worse, new nations like Yugoslavia and Czechoslovakia emerged, blocking Italian ambitions. At the Versailles Peace Conference, Italian diplomats left the table humiliated. Britain and France had used Italy's soldiers, but dismissed Italy's demands. To the Italian public, this was a national insult. Outrage boiled over. Nationalists shouted in the streets that Italy had been stabbed in the back by its own allies. Newspapers filled with fiery headlines about betrayal. Veterans who had sacrificed everything now asked, for what? This feeling of dishonor ran deep. It was not just about land, it was about respect, dignity, and recognition. Italians felt cheated of their rightful place among the great powers. For many, democracy seemed powerless to defend Italy's pride. In this atmosphere of rage and disappointment, dangerous ideas began to spread. Writers and politicians called for revenge, for strength, for unity under one leader who would never let Italy be humiliated again. The seeds of fascism were watered not only by hunger and poverty, but by this deep wound of national betrayal. Mussolini would take this humiliation and twist it into fuel, convincing Italians that only through fascism could their honor be restored. The mutilated victory was not just a broken promise, it was the spark that lit the fire of dictatorship. The war was over, but for Italy, peace did not bring prosperity. Instead, it unleashed an economic disaster. By 1919, inflation had spiraled out of control. The cost of bread, flour, and basic necessities soared far beyond the reach of ordinary families. Wages lost their value almost overnight. Workers who had endured years of sacrifice during the war now found their paychecks worthless. The lira crumbled, savings vanished, and despair spread from cities to villages. Factories that had thrived on wartime production now closed their doors. Veterans who had once carried rifles now stood in long lines, searching for jobs that no longer existed. In Milan and Turin, entire industries collapsed, leaving tens of thousands unemployed. In the countryside, peasants demanded land reform. Large estates lay idle, while millions went hungry. Angry farmers occupied fields, seizing land in acts of desperation. This land hunger shook the foundations of the old aristocracy and terrified wealthy landowners. Strikes erupted across the nation. In the industrial north, workers occupied factories and flew red flags above their gates. In the south, peasants clashed with police over land seizures. The streets filled with demonstrations, sometimes turning into riots, with the army called in to restore order. The liberal government seemed paralyzed. Politicians bickered in parliament, unable to provide relief or stability. Their inaction only deepened the public's frustration. To many Italians, democracy felt weak, inefficient, and incapable of solving the crisis. This chaos created fertile ground for extremism. On one side, the Socialist Party gained momentum, calling for revolution, inspired by Lenin's Bolsheviks in Russia. On the other, new nationalist voices argued that only strength, discipline, and unity could save Italy. The economic collapse was not just a financial disaster, it was a political earthquake. From the hunger of the streets and the failure of the state, a dangerous question emerged. If democracy cannot save Italy, who can? The answer, soon enough, would be Mussolini. Italy's post-war turmoil soon reached its boiling point, in what became known as the Biennio Rosso, the 2 red years. From 1919 to 1920, waves of strikes, protests, and factory occupations swept across the nation, sending fear into the hearts of Italy's ruling elite. Inspired by the Russian Revolution of 1917, Italian socialists and anarchists dreamed of creating their own workers' state. In the industrial cities of the north, Milan, Turin, Genoa, workers took control of factories, hoisting red flags and forming councils to manage production. They declared, "The factories belong to us." In the countryside, peasants seized land from absentee landlords, redistributing it among themselves, in scenes reminiscent of revolution. For many, it seemed Italy stood on the brink of a Bolshevik-style uprising. Demonstrations filled the streets with chants for equality, justice, and revolution. Socialist newspapers spread fiery rhetoric. Armed workers organized defense groups, determined to protect their gains. But what inspired workers filled the wealthy and middle classes with terror. Landowners, businessmen, and Catholic conservatives feared the destruction of private property and the overthrow of traditional society. To them, the red threat was chaos itself. a threat to civilization. The liberal government once again proved weak. Instead of addressing the people's grievances, it hesitated, paralyzed by indecision. It relied on police and the army to suppress uprisings, but unrest only grew. Into this volatile landscape stepped new forces, paramilitary squads, often composed of angry veterans and nationalists, who promised to crush socialism by any means. Dressed in black shirts, they attacked strikes, burned union offices, and beat activists in the streets. Though still small, these groups were growing, and soon they would be organized under one ambitious leader, Benito Mussolini. The Biennio Rosso revealed a divided Italy. On one side, workers and peasants demanding radical change. On the other, the middle and upper classes desperate for order. The clash between these visions would pave the way for fascism. For many Italians, it seemed they had to choose revolution or reaction. In the coming years, Mussolini would present himself as the solution to both. In the chaos of post-war Italy, one man was about to rise above the noise: Benito Mussolini. His path was unusual, even contradictory. Born in 1883, to a blacksmith father and a devout Catholic mother, Mussolini grew up in poverty, exposed to both radical socialism and strict discipline. In his youth he became a fiery socialist, editing newspapers and denouncing war as the tool of imperialists. He was jailed multiple times for his agitation, earning a reputation as a revolutionary firebrand. But as the Great War unfolded, Mussolini's ideology shifted. Where once he had condemned militarism, he now declared that war was necessary to forge a new Italy. In 1914, he broke with the Socialist Party, which opposed intervention, and began advocating for Italy's entry into World War I. This decision was pivotal. He reinvented himself as a nationalist, declaring that socialism had failed and that Italy needed a new ideology, one based on strength, unity, and action. He began gathering veterans, students, and disillusioned radicals into small groups dedicated to defending the honor of Italy. These would soon become the nucleus of fascism. Charismatic, ruthless, and opportunistic, Mussolini understood how to harness the anger of the masses. He knew the power of speeches, newspapers, and imagery. He presented himself not as a politician bound by compromise, but as a man of destiny. By 1919, Mussolini had founded the Fasci di Combattimento, the first fascist movement. It was not yet a political powerhouse, but its seeds were sown in Italy's soil of despair. Veterans in black shirts marched under his banners. Young men cheered his fiery words. To them, Mussolini embodied the promise of order, discipline, and revenge against a world that had humiliated Italy. His journey from socialist agitator to nationalist leader was complete. Italy had found its would-be savior, though few realized the storm he was preparing to unleash. On a spring day in March 1919, Benito Mussolini gathered a small group of war veterans, nationalists, and restless young men in Milan's Piazza San Sepolcro. They met in a modest hall, but their ambitions reached the heavens. From this assembly, the Fasci di Combattimento, the fighting leagues, were born. It was the official beginning of fascism. The movement's name evoked ancient Rome. Fasces, a bundle of rods bound around an axe, symbolized unity through strength and discipline. For Mussolini, it was the perfect emblem of his new ideology. Individuals were weak, but bound together under one leader, they became unbreakable. Fascism's early program was a strange blend of radical and nationalist ideas. It called for universal suffrage, an 8-hour workday, and land reform to appeal to workers and peasants. Yet it also promised to defend property, restore national pride, and build a strong Italy. Mussolini was pragmatic. He did not care about consistency, only about power. At first, fascism was small and disorganized. The first meeting attracted barely 100 members. Many Italians dismissed it as a passing fad, an echo of Mussolini's failed socialist career. But beneath the surface, fascism was different from traditional parties. It was not just politics, it was action. Its followers wore uniforms, carried clubs, and promised to fight in the streets against socialism, communism, and anyone they saw as a threat to Italy. Fascism spoke to those who felt betrayed and abandoned, veterans who longed for brotherhood, students who craved adventure, landowners who feared revolution, and middle-class citizens tired of instability. Unlike the weak liberal parties or the divided socialists, fascism projected energy, decisiveness, and strength. Mussolini understood the importance of symbols and myth. He wrapped fascism in the imagery of Rome, the glory of empire, and the promise of national rebirth. He was no longer a failed socialist agitator. He was now Il Duce, the leader of a new movement destined to save Italy. Though still fragile in 1919, fascism had taken its first breath. It was a new creed for a wounded nation. In the years ahead, it would grow into a storm that would sweep away democracy and drag Italy into dictatorship. By 1920, fascism had found its weapon: violence. What began as a small political movement now took the form of paramilitary squads known as the squadristi, or Blackshirts. These men, often disillusioned veterans, unemployed youths, and nationalists, were united not just by ideology, but by action. Their mission was simple: to break the power of socialism in the streets. Armed with clubs, knives, and sometimes pistols, they stormed union halls, burned socialist newspapers, and beat activists until they fled in terror. Factories occupied by workers were liberated by force. Farmers striking for land reforms were crushed by squads hired by landowners. Fascism's appeal grew because of this brutal efficiency. To frightened elites, industrialists, landowners, and conservatives, Blackshirts became a necessary evil. Where the state was weak, fascists provided order. Where the police hesitated, Mussolini's men acted. The violence was theatrical, as much as it was political. Blackshirts marched in disciplined columns through villages, carrying torches and chanting fascist slogans. Their black uniforms gave them a sense of unity and intimidation. To opponents, they were a nightmare. To supporters, they were heroes defending Italy from chaos. The liberal government looked on, powerless. Sometimes it condemned the violence, but more often it tolerated it, hoping the fascists would weaken socialism without destabilizing the nation entirely. This failure to act gave Mussolini's squads free rein. Mussolini himself carefully maintained a double image. To the public, he claimed fascism sought peace, order, and patriotism. But behind the scenes, he encouraged violence as the tool that would break democracy and bring him to power. For many Italians, especially the middle class and rural elites, the violence was not frightening, it was reassuring. They saw in the Blackshirts the energy, discipline, and determination that the government lacked. To them, Mussolini was not a thug, but a savior. By turning politics into a battlefield, Mussolini changed the rules of the game. No longer was power won through debate or elections, it was won in the streets, through blood and intimidation. The rise of fascism was not just a political story, it was a war fought in the alleys, fields, and squares of Italy. A war that Mussolini's Blackshirts were determined to win. Fascism was not built only on violence, it was also built on myth and propaganda. Mussolini understood that words, images, and symbols could be as powerful as fists. To rule Italy, he would not only need to conquer its cities, but also its imagination. From the very beginning, Mussolini controlled his message. A former journalist, he knew the press could shape public opinion. He founded newspapers that glorified fascist victories, exaggerated the threat of socialism, and portrayed himself as Italy's savior. Every march, every rally, every Blackshirt raid was carefully staged for dramatic effect. Symbols became central to the movement. The black shirt itself was not just clothing, it was a uniform that transformed ordinary men into warriors of a new Italy. The Roman fasces became the fascist emblem, connecting the movement to the glory of the ancient empire. Rallies were filled with banners, torches, and chants designed to stir emotions and inspire loyalty. Mussolini also crafted a personal myth. He presented himself as fearless, tireless, and destined to lead. Newspapers published images of him riding horses, fencing, flying airplanes, or bare-chested at the beach. He was not just a politician, He was a man of action, the embodiment of vigor and virility. To many Italians weary of weak governments and endless debates, this image was irresistible. Mussolini seemed like the antidote to corruption and chaos, a leader who would restore pride and discipline. Propaganda also targeted youth. Fascist organizations taught children to salute the flag, chant slogans, and believe that Mussolini was the father of the nation. Schools emphasized obedience, patriotism, and sacrifice. A new generation was raised not to question but to follow. The genius of fascist propaganda lay in its ability to offer hope while hiding reality. Behind the grand parades and fiery speeches lay brutality, censorship, and manipulation. But many Italians embraced the myth willingly. They wanted to believe in greatness, in unity, in destiny. Mussolini gave them the spectacle they craved. By turning politics into theater, Mussolini transformed fascism into more than a movement. It became a faith, a cult of nation, leader, and empire. A faith that would soon dominate every corner of Italian life. While Mussolini and his fascists grew in strength, the government of liberal Italy grew weaker by the day. Since the unification of Italy in 1861, the parliamentary system had been plagued by instability. Prime ministers came and went in rapid succession, coalitions were fragile, and corruption was widespread. By the early 1920s, this weakness was glaring. Italy faced hunger, strikes, land seizures, and violence in the streets. Yet its leaders seemed incapable of action. Debates in parliament dragged on endlessly, while outside, factories burned and Blackshirts marched. For ordinary Italians, democracy looked powerless, little more than empty words, while the country collapsed. Liberal politicians, tied to old elites, had lost the trust of workers and peasants. They failed to deliver meaningful land reform, fair wages, or effective governance. Worse, they underestimated the fascists. Many saw Mussolini as a temporary nuisance, a rabble-rouser who could be contained. Some even believed his squads were useful for breaking strikes and countering socialism. The Socialist Party, though large, was deeply divided between moderates and revolutionaries. Instead of uniting against fascism, they argued among themselves, weakening their position. The Catholic Popular Party, meanwhile, struggled to balance church interests with politics. This fragmentation created a vacuum. In a nation desperate for strong leadership, no one could provide stability. The middle class, alarmed by socialist unrest and fearful of economic collapse, began to see Mussolini's decisiveness as preferable to the endless squabbles of parliament. Industrialists and landowners, tired of strikes and occupations, secretly funded fascist squads. Even some liberals believed Mussolini might restore order where they could not. The weakness of liberal Italy was not just political, it was psychological. Italians had lost faith in democracy itself. To them, democracy meant corruption, indecision, and chaos. Mussolini seized on this sentiment, presenting himself as the man of action who could cut through bureaucracy and deliver results. In truth, it was this failure of democracy, not just fascist violence, that opened the door to dictatorship. By failing to defend itself, the liberal system doomed itself. And as Italians turned away from parliament, they turned toward the man who promised a new, stronger Italy, Benito Mussolini. October 1922. Italy stood at the edge of a political earthquake. Strikes, protests, and violence had paralyzed the country. The liberal government was crumbling. Benito Mussolini saw his chance, and he was ready to seize it. He called upon his Blackshirts to mobilize. Tens of thousands of fascist squadristi, dressed in their black uniforms, marched toward the capital in what became known as the March on Rome. With rifles slung over their shoulders and banners waving high, they advanced through towns and villages, hailed by some as heroes and feared by others as conquerors. In truth, Mussolini did not lead the march himself. He remained in Milan, calculating and cautious, ready to flee to Switzerland if it failed. But the image of Mussolini's men marching on Rome electrified Italy. It was a show of force, a spectacle of power designed to intimidate both enemies and allies. Inside Rome, Prime Minister Luigi Facta's government panicked. Facta declared a state of siege, ordering the army to disperse the fascists. But the final decision rested with King Victor Emmanuel III. Weak and indecisive, the king feared civil war more than Mussolini. Believing the army might not fire on the Blackshirts, he refused to sign the order. That hesitation changed history. The march continued without real resistance. On October 29, 1922, the king invited Mussolini to form a government. At just 39 years old, Mussolini became Italy's prime minister, the youngest in its history. What had started as a radical fringe movement now stood at the gates of power. Mussolini arrived in Rome, not by democratic victory, but by intimidation and royal consent. The March on Rome was more myth than battle. Few shots were fired, but its impact was enormous. It marked the death of liberal Italy and the birth of fascist Italy. Through bold theater, threats, and the weakness of others, Mussolini had turned himself into Il Duce, the man who would reshape a nation. At the center of Italy's political crisis in 1922 stood King Victor Emmanuel III. Short in stature, cautious by nature, he seemed an unlikely figure to decide the fate of a nation. Yet his choices during the March on Rome sealed Italy's destiny. Victor Emmanuel had inherited the throne in 1900, after the assassination of his father, King Umberto I. Unlike his father, who had been stern and authoritarian, Victor was indecisive, pragmatic, and deeply concerned with preserving the monarchy above all else. His reign coincided with turbulent years: World War I, economic collapse, social unrest, and now the rise of fascism. During the March on Rome, Prime Minister Luigi Facta urged the king to defend democracy. Facta drafted a decree for a state of siege, which would have allowed the army to disperse Mussolini's Blackshirts by force. All it needed was the king's signature, but Victor Emmanuel hesitated. He doubted the loyalty of the army, fearing that many officers sympathized with the fascists. He feared civil war if soldiers refused to fire on their fellow Italians. He also feared socialism more than fascism, believing Mussolini might restore order and protect the monarchy from revolution. On October 28, 1922, Victor Emmanuel made his fateful decision. He refused to sign the decree. Instead, he invited Mussolini to Rome to form a government. It was not democracy that saved Italy from collapse, but monarchy's compromise with dictatorship. This act transformed Mussolini from a radical agitator into a legitimate prime minister. The king imagined he could control Mussolini, using him as a tool to stabilize Italy. Instead, Mussolini would soon eclipse him, reducing the monarchy to a powerless symbol. For the Italian people, Victor Emmanuel's decision was a turning point. Some saw him as a coward, betraying democracy in its hour of need. Others saw him as pragmatic, avoiding civil war. But in history's judgment, his inaction opened the gates to dictatorship. The king who feared chaos had instead invited tyranny, and though Mussolini would rule Italy, it was Victor Emmanuel's signature withheld that made fascism possible. On October 29, 1922, Benito Mussolini stepped off a train in Rome, summoned by the king to form a government. At just 39 years old, the former socialist agitator, journalist and war veteran, now stood on the threshold of power as Italy's prime minister. The sight was remarkable. While tens of thousands of Blackshirts had converged on Rome to pressure the monarchy, Mussolini himself arrived calmly, wearing a dark suit, not a military uniform. He understood the importance of appearances. He would not seize power like a bandit, but receive it as a statesman. When Mussolini entered the Quirinal Palace, King Victor Emmanuel III greeted him not as a criminal, but as the savior of Italy. With the royal mandate, Mussolini was tasked to form a coalition government. At first, his cabinet included not only fascists, but also liberals, conservatives, and even Catholics. This gave his rule an air of legitimacy, convincing many Italians that fascism was not a revolution, but simply another government within the parliamentary system. Yet Mussolini wasted no time in showing his strength. In his first speech to Parliament, he reminded deputies that he could have taken power by force, declaring, "I could have turned this drab assembly into a bivouac of my maniples. I could have dismissed Parliament and formed a government of fascists alone, but I have chosen not to, and that, gentlemen, is my act of moderation." The chamber, filled with deputies intimidated by the Blackshirts in the streets, gave him a standing ovation. In truth, Mussolini held far fewer seats than the majority, but the fear of violence ensured obedience. For the Italian middle class, Mussolini's rise seemed like a relief. At last, here was a leader who projected strength, order, and decisiveness. For industrialists and landowners, he was a tool to break the power of socialism. For the king, he was a shield against revolution. But Mussolini himself saw further. He knew his coalition was only temporary. His ultimate goal was absolute power. The parliamentary stage was merely a stepping stone toward dictatorship. The transformation of Italy had begun. Democracy was still alive, barely, but its days were numbered. Mussolini was in power, and he intended never to let it go. Mussolini had taken power, but he knew his grip on Italy was still fragile. In 1922, fascists held only a fraction of the seats in parliament. To turn his tenuous coalition into domination, he needed to change the rules of the game. The weapon he chose was the Acerbo law, named after its sponsor, Giacomo Acerbo, a fascist deputy. The law proposed a radical reform to Italy's electoral system. It declared that whichever party received the largest share of votes in an election, at least 25%, would automatically be awarded 2/3 of the seats in parliament. The remaining 1/3 would be divided among the other parties. This law was nothing less than the legal dismantling of democracy. No longer would proportional representation allow Italy's divided parties to check one another. Instead, a minority movement like fascism could, with a modest share of votes, seize total parliamentary control. The bill was introduced in July 1923. Mussolini justified it with his usual mixture of menace and persuasion. He claimed Italy needed strong, stable government, not endless bickering. He insisted the law would end chaos, strengthen the nation, and protect against socialism. But behind his rhetoric lay intimidation. Blackshirts filled the streets, standing outside the homes of deputies, reminding them what disobedience could cost. When the law came to a vote, many politicians were terrified. Liberals and conservatives, who had once dismissed Mussolini as a reckless agitator, now gave him their support. The Catholic Popular Party, pressured and divided, chose not to resist. Even those who opposed the law often did so in whispers. In November 1923, the Acerbo law passed. Its passage marked a decisive step toward dictatorship. Mussolini had not abolished parliament, he had bent it to his will. In the next election, fascists would exploit this system to secure an overwhelming majority, even without majority support. The Acerbo law was proof of Mussolini's cunning. Unlike revolutionaries who toppled governments with fire and blood, Mussolini dismantled democracy with signatures and laws, cloaked in legality. He was building a dictatorship step by step, brick by brick, until resistance seemed impossible. The facade of democracy remained, but the foundation had crumbled. Italy had crossed another threshold on the road to fascism. By 1924, Mussolini's grip on Italy seemed secure. The Acerbo law had guaranteed his fascists a parliamentary majority, but one man dared to challenge him openly: Giacomo Matteotti, a brave socialist deputy. In May 1924, national elections were held under fascist intimidation. Blackshirts filled polling stations, threatening voters, burning opposition offices, and silencing critics. Despite this terror, many Italians still voted against fascism. But the Acerbo law gave Mussolini's party a sweeping majority in parliament. On June 30, 1924, Giacomo Matteotti rose to speak in the Chamber of Deputies. With fiery courage, he denounced the election as a fraud. He accused the fascists of violence, intimidation, and corruption. His words were bold, uncompromising, and dangerous. In front of Mussolini and his deputies, he declared the regime's victory illegitimate. Days later, Matteotti disappeared. On June 10, he was kidnapped in broad daylight near his home in Rome. Witnesses saw him forced into a car by fascist thugs. For weeks Italy buzzed with rumors. Finally, his body was discovered in a shallow grave outside the city, beaten and stabbed to death. The murder shocked Italy. Outrage spread across the nation. Opposition deputies walked out of parliament in protest, forming what became known as the Aventine Secession. Newspapers demanded Mussolini's resignation. Citizens filled the streets, calling for justice. For the first time, the regime seemed vulnerable. Mussolini was shaken but not broken. At first he denied involvement, blaming rogue fascists for the crime. But as pressure mounted, he realized that retreat would mean collapse. In January 1925, Mussolini delivered a defiant speech to Parliament. Instead of apologizing, he took responsibility, not for the murder, but for the movement's violence. He declared that if fascism was to rule Italy, it would do so openly, without compromise. That speech marked the turning point. The Mattotti crisis had brought Mussolini to the brink, but his bold defiance turned weakness into strength. The opposition, divided and powerless, could not act. The king, still fearful of civil war, refused to dismiss him. The storm passed, and Mussolini emerged stronger than ever. The death of Giacomo Mattotti was more than a political assassination. It was the death of Italian democracy. After 1925, Mussolini no longer hid behind coalitions or legality. Fascism would rule openly, and Il Duce would become dictator. The murder of Giacomo Mattotti had shaken Italy to its core. For months, Mussolini's regime teetered on the edge of collapse. Citizens demanded justice, the opposition denounced fascism, and even members of his own movement whispered about his downfall. Yet by early 1925, Mussolini made his boldest move. He transformed crisis into conquest. On January 3, 1925, Mussolini addressed the Chamber of Deputies. The hall was tense, deputies uncertain whether Il Duce would resign or be forced out. Instead, Mussolini delivered a defiant declaration. He accepted political, moral, and historical responsibility for fascist violence, not just Matteotti's murder, but all the brutality of the squads. Then, with blazing confidence, he announced that he intended to crush all opposition. The speech stunned Italy. It was not an apology, but a proclamation of dictatorship. Mussolini had thrown off the mask of moderation. From that day, fascism no longer pretended to share power. It openly ruled by force. The opposition, fragmented and powerless, could do nothing. The Aventine deputies remained outside Parliament, hoping the king would act. But King Victor Emmanuel III, paralyzed by fear of civil war, continued to support Mussolini. The monarchy had tied itself to fascism's fate. In the months that followed, Mussolini dismantled democracy piece by piece. Freedom of the press was curtailed. Opposition newspapers were shut down. Political parties were banned, leaving only the fascist party. Mayors across Italy were replaced with fascist officials known as podestà, appointed directly from Rome. A secret police force, the OVRA, was created to monitor and suppress dissent. By 1926, Mussolini ruled by decree. Parliament had been reduced to a rubber stamp, existing only to applaud Il Duce's decisions. The liberal system that had governed Italy since unification was dead. Mussolini's rise from agitator to prime minister had taken just 3 years, but his transformation from politician to dictator took only months. He now stood as the unchallenged ruler of Italy. The Matteotti crisis, which could have destroyed him, instead became the foundation of his dictatorship. Mussolini had proven his ruthlessness, his cunning, and his ability to turn weakness into strength. Italy entered a new era, an era where fascism was not simply a party, but the state itself. By 1926, Mussolini had completed his transformation from prime minister to dictator. What emerged was no longer a parliamentary democracy, but the fascist state, a regime that sought to control every aspect of Italian life. At its core was the idea that the individual was nothing, and the nation was everything. Mussolini declared, "All within the state, nothing outside the state, nothing against the state." This was not mere rhetoric, it was the guiding principle of fascist rule. The machinery of control spread quickly. Opposition parties were outlawed, leaving the Fascist Party as the only legal political force. Parliament, once a place of debate, became little more than a stage for choreographed approval of Il Duce's decrees. Local democracy was dismantled, as mayors were replaced with appointed fascist podesta. Censorship tightened its grip. Newspapers, radio broadcasts, and films were placed under fascist control. Only stories that glorified the regime or Mussolini himself could be told. Dissenting voices were silenced, sometimes through imprisonment, sometimes through violence. The OVR, Mussolini's secret police, monitored the population, infiltrated opposition groups, and punished those who dared speak against the state. Fear became a constant presence in daily life. Education was transformed into a tool of indoctrination. Schools taught children to revere Mussolini and obey authority without question. Textbooks were rewritten to glorify fascist values and Italy's imperial destiny. Youth organizations trained boys for war and girls for motherhood, instilling loyalty from the youngest age. Even culture was brought under fascist influence. Artists, writers, and filmmakers were expected to serve the state. Architecture reflected fascist ideals, monumental, imposing, designed to project strength and permanence. The regime's message was relentless. Mussolini was not just a politician, but the embodiment of Italy's will. His image appeared everywhere, on posters, in classrooms, in parades. Italians were expected to salute him, cheer for him, and see him as the father of the nation. Yet beneath the spectacle and propaganda lay a grim reality, a society stripped of freedom, where obedience replaced debate, and fear replaced choice. Italians who resisted faced prison, exile, or worse. Many adapted, some resisted quietly, and others embraced the regime enthusiastically. The fascist state was more than a government. It was a system designed to mold minds, control bodies, and suppress opposition. An all-encompassing dictatorship that promised glory but delivered submission. No dictatorship survives without a myth, and Mussolini understood this better than anyone. From the mid-1920s onward, fascism constructed a vast cult of personality around Il Duce. Mussolini was no longer just a political leader. He was portrayed as the living embodiment of Italy's strength, discipline, and destiny. Propaganda flooded the nation with his image. Posters showed him as tireless and heroic, riding horses, fencing, flying planes, harvesting wheat. Mussolini was everywhere, in newspapers, newsreels, and classrooms. His speeches were broadcast across Italy. His portrait hung in every public building. To be Italian was to honor Il Duce. The regime worked tirelessly to present Mussolini as infallible. He was depicted as a man of the people yet superior to all, a father to the nation, a soldier, a statesman, and even a cultural figure. Italians were encouraged to believe he never made mistakes, that his vision alone guided the nation. Crowds were carefully staged for his speeches. Tens of thousands gathered in piazzas, chanting, "Duce, Duce, Duce," in unison. His balcony addresses became rituals of loyalty, blending politics with theater. For many Italians, swept up in the spectacle, Mussolini seemed almost divine. But the cult was not only about admiration, it was about control. By making Mussolini the focus of devotion, fascism replaced loyalty to democracy, community, or family, with loyalty to one man. To oppose Il Duce was to oppose Italy itself. Behind the image, Mussolini was still a shrewd, pragmatic politician, full of flaws, contradictions, and insecurities. But through relentless propaganda, those flaws were hidden. The myth of Mussolini became stronger than the man himself. This cult of personality did more than elevate Mussolini. It erased dissent, silenced criticism, and bound the people to fascism with emotion, not reason. Italy no longer had a prime minister, it had a Duce, a leader beyond question. Fascism sought not only to control politics, but also to reshape society itself. Nowhere was this more evident than in its policies toward women and the family. Mussolini's regime believed that Italy's strength depended on population growth. and that women's primary duty was to bear children for the nation. From the beginning, fascist propaganda glorified motherhood. Women were told that their highest honor was to raise strong sons for the army and virtuous daughters for the home. The regime launched the battle for births, aiming to raise Italy's population to 60 million by 1950. Families with many children were rewarded with tax breaks and medals, while bachelors were taxed as punishment. Mussolini often declared, "Numbers are power. Nations with falling populations are doomed." Under fascism, women were encouraged to leave the workforce and dedicate themselves to family life. Professions such as teaching and medicine were restricted, with quotas limiting the number of women. Female identity was tied to motherhood and obedience. Yet this vision was not entirely embraced. Many Italian women resisted quietly, continuing to work, study, and engage in public life. Urban women especially resented being forced into traditional roles. Nonetheless, fascist propaganda relentlessly portrayed the ideal woman as a dutiful wife, modest, fertile, and loyal to il duce. The family was reimagined as the foundation of the state. Children belonged not only to their parents but to fascism. Schools and youth organizations reinforced the regime's values, weakening the role of parents in shaping their children's beliefs. This control over family life extended to law. Divorce remained illegal, contraception was restricted, and abortion was harshly punished. Mussolini presented himself as the father of the nation, turning private life into a matter of politics. The fascist view of women was contradictory. On one hand, they were exalted as mothers of the nation. On the other, they were denied political power, economic independence, and equality. Fascism used women as symbols of purity and tradition, but denied them autonomy. In the fascist state, women were not individuals with rights. They were vessels of the nation's future, defined by their role in service to il duce and Italy. Fascism was not only a political system, it also aimed to reshape Italy's economy. Mussolini promised a third way between capitalism and socialism, a system he called the corporate state. The idea was bold. Instead of workers and employers fighting each other, both would be united in corporations under state supervision. Each corporation represented an industry, agriculture, transport, manufacturing, commerce, and brought together employers, workers, and government officials. In theory, these groups would collaborate for the common good, resolving disputes peacefully. In reality, the corporate state was far from cooperative. It was a mechanism of control. Independent trade unions were banned, replaced by fascist syndicates. Strikes became illegal, as did lockouts by employers. Workers lost their bargaining power, while employers gained protection from socialist demands. The state, through the Fascist Party, dictated wages, working hours, and labor policies. Propaganda hailed the corporate state as a revolutionary model that overcame class conflict. Mussolini boasted that it was more efficient than liberal capitalism and less divisive than socialism. He declared it the future of the modern world, presenting Italy as a pioneer of a new economic order. But in practice, the system served the regime more than the people. Corporations became bureaucratic tools, rubber-stamping government decisions rather than balancing interests. Workers remained powerless, their rights stripped in the name of unity. Employers, especially large industrialists, benefited most, securing profits without fear of strikes or opposition. The corporate state was less about economics and more about symbolism. It reinforced fascism's claim that the individual was secondary to the nation, that all Italians must serve the greater whole. It presented Mussolini as the mediator of class struggle, the leader who could harmonize society under his rule. Though it failed to solve Italy's economic problems, the corporate state became one of fascism's proudest boasts, a system unique to Mussolini's Italy, praised by fascists as the future, and remembered by history as another tool of dictatorship. For decades, relations between the Italian state and the Catholic Church had been bitter. Since Italy's unification in 1870, the papacy had refused to recognize the new kingdom, outraged by the loss of the papal states. Popes declared themselves prisoners in the Vatican, and millions of devout Catholics viewed the state with hostility. Mussolini saw this division as a threat, but also as an opportunity. If he could reconcile the state with the Church, he would legitimize his regime and gain the loyalty of millions of believers. After years of careful negotiation, the breakthrough came in 1929 with the Lateran Accords. Signed between Mussolini and Cardinal Gasperi, representing Pope Pius XI, the accords ended the so-called Roman question. The Vatican was recognized as an independent sovereign state, the smallest in the world, but symbolically powerful. Catholicism was declared the official religion of Italy. The Church regained privileges in education, marriage, and public life, while receiving financial compensation for its lost territories. For Mussolini, the Lateran Accords were a political triumph. They gave him the support of the Catholic Church, which urged Italians to cooperate with the fascist regime. Bishops praised Il Duce as the man who had resolved a conflict no liberal government had managed to solve. Catholic masses now echoed with prayers not only for the Pope, but also for Mussolini. For the Church, the Accords brought recognition, security, and renewed influence. For ordinary Italians, it was a relief. Two great pillars of their identity, nation and faith, were no longer in conflict. The Lateran Accords strengthened Mussolini's dictatorship immeasurably. With the Church on his side, opposition seemed impossible. Fascism had not only conquered politics and society, it now had the blessing of God. But this alliance was uneasy. Though united in the short term, tensions remained between Church teachings and fascist ideology. For now, however, Mussolini had secured what no other Italian leader had achieved: peace with the Vatican and the holy approval of his rule. If Mussolini wanted fascism to endure, he knew he needed to shape not only the present but the future generation. To do this, the regime launched a massive campaign of indoctrination, targeting children and youth. From the earliest age, Italian children were immersed in fascist ideology. Schools were reorganized to serve the state. Textbooks were rewritten to glorify Mussolini, the fascist party, and Italy's imperial destiny. History lessons emphasized Rome's ancient glory, teaching children that fascism was the natural heir of the Roman Empire. Teachers were required to swear loyalty to Il Duce. Outside the classroom, fascist youth organizations became central to life. For boys, there was the Opera Nazionale Balilla, where they learned discipline, obedience, and military training. Uniforms, parades, and salutes filled their days, preparing them to serve as soldiers. For older boys, the Avanguardisti offered more advanced training, including drills with weapons. For girls, youth organizations emphasized domestic skills, motherhood, and loyalty to the state. They were trained to become mothers of fascists, the bearers of future generations. The goal was clear: to create a generation of Italians who would not question fascism, but live it as faith. Mussolini himself declared, "I educate the young with my doctrines, I mold their souls." Rituals reinforced this indoctrination. Children saluted Mussolini's portrait each morning, recited fascist slogans, and sang hymns to Il Duce. Youth rallies drew thousands, with young voices chanting in unison, their loyalty fused with spectacle. Not all families embraced this. Some parents resented the regime's intrusion into their children's lives. Others, especially in rural areas, resisted quietly. But for millions of Italian children, fascism was their world. They grew up not knowing democracy, only the cult of obedience. Through schools and youth organizations, Mussolini tried to ensure that fascism would outlive him, that Italy's future would be a generation of loyal, unquestioning citizens. The regime's control of youth was one of its most powerful weapons. While Mussolini tightened his grip on Italy, not all Italians bowed their heads. Intellectuals, socialists, liberals, Catholics, and ordinary citizens tried to resist. But under fascism, opposition came at a terrible cost. By 1926, political opposition was outlawed. Socialist and liberal parties were banned, their leaders driven into exile, arrested, or silenced. Opposition newspapers were shut down, their editors jailed. Trade unions were destroyed. replaced by fascist syndicates under state control. Those who dared to resist openly often paid with their lives. Activists were beaten by Blackshirts, imprisoned or assassinated. Some escaped abroad, forming exile communities in France, Switzerland, and the United States, where they published anti-fascist newspapers and tried to rally international support. But inside Italy, resistance became almost impossible. The fascist regime built a network of prisons and internment camps for political opponents. Some were sent to remote islands, isolated from society. Many endured years of silence and fear, their voices erased from public life. Ordinary Italians learned to censor themselves. Conversations in cafes, letters sent through the post, even private gatherings could be monitored. To criticize Il Duce was to risk arrest, job loss, or worse. Fear seeped into everyday life. Yet despite the repression, opposition survived in small ways. Families whispered anti-fascist jokes at home. Underground groups secretly circulated pamphlets. Priests and intellectuals sometimes voiced quiet criticism. These acts were small, but they kept alive the flame of resistance. The paradox of fascist repression was clear. Mussolini's dictatorship seemed strong, yet it relied on constant violence, censorship, and fear. Without silencing opposition, it could not stand. By the late 1920s, fascism appeared unchallenged. But beneath the surface, resentment lingered, waiting for the day when fear would give way to defiance. Every dictatorship needs eyes and ears in the shadows. For Mussolini, that role was filled by the OVR, Italy's secret police, created in 1927. Its name was deliberately mysterious. Some said it meant Organizzazione di Vigilanza Repressione dell'Antifascismo, Organization for Vigilance and Repression of Antifascism, while others believed it was chosen simply because it sounded ominous. The OVR became the backbone of fascist repression. Its agents infiltrated workplaces, schools, unions, and even churches. Informants were everywhere. A neighbor, a co-worker, even a friend could report you. Italians lived with the constant fear that careless words might reach the ears of the regime. Surveillance was relentless. Mail was opened, telephones tapped, and gatherings monitored. Suspected opponents were arrested without trial, interrogated, and often sent to remote prison islands such as Lipari or Ponza. Some disappeared altogether, victims of brutal accidents. The OVR also coordinated with Blackshirts and local fascist officials, ensuring that dissent was crushed at every level. It created an atmosphere of paranoia that stifled resistance before it could grow. Even small acts of defiance, jokes, graffiti, underground pamphlets could bring swift punishment. To the outside world, Mussolini boasted that Italy was a nation of order and loyalty. In reality, it was a nation of silence, where fear of the OVR kept millions in line. The existence of the OVR also fed Mussolini's cult of personality. Citizens were made to believe that Il Duce knew everything, saw everything, and was always watching. Whether or not the OVR truly had such power mattered less than the perception. The shadow of the secret police was enough. By the 1930s, the OVR had become a vast and efficient instrument of state terror. It did not rely on mass killings like other dictatorships, but its constant pressure crushed political life and silenced opposition. Italy had been transformed into a surveillance state, where trust was eroded and freedom extinguished. While Mussolini secured his dictatorship at home, he began to look outward. Fascism was not just an Italian experiment. It was, in Mussolini's vision, the rebirth of empire. His foreign policy was guided by two ambitions: to make Italy respected among the great powers, and to build a new Roman Empire in the Mediterranean and beyond. From the start, Mussolini's speeches were filled with boasts of expansion. He spoke of Italy's vital space, arguing that the nation needed more land to support its people. The Mediterranean, he claimed, must become Mare Nostrum, our sea, just as it had been under ancient Rome. In the 1920s, Mussolini tested the waters of aggression. In 1923, Italian forces bombarded the Greek island of Corfu after a border incident. International outrage, forced a withdrawal, but the action revealed Mussolini's willingness to use force to assert Italy's power. He also sought to expand influence in the Balkans and the Middle East, signing treaties and interfering in regional politics. Albania became a virtual Italian protectorate. The regime also eyed North Africa, particularly Ethiopia, as a target for imperial conquest. Propaganda played a key role. Mussolini staged parades, speeches, and naval displays to show Italy as a rising power. Children were taught in schools that Italy was destined to rule again, and maps were drawn with arrows pointing outward from Rome. At the same time, Mussolini positioned himself as a statesman. He attended international conferences, portraying Italy as a mediator between nations. For many Europeans, he seemed a modern leader, firm but rational. Few realized how aggressive his ambitions truly were. Foreign policy became central to Mussolini's cult of leadership. At home, he was il duce. Abroad, he sought to be seen as a new Caesar. These early moves laid the groundwork for the imperial adventures of the 1930s, when Mussolini would gamble everything on war and conquest. By the mid-1930s, Mussolini was ready to gamble on a bold move, the conquest of Ethiopia. Italy had long dreamed of building an African empire. Its defeat at ADWA in 1896, when Ethiopian forces crushed an Italian army, was a humiliation that Mussolini swore to avenge. In October 1935, Italian troops poured across the borders of Ethiopia from Eritrea and Italian Somaliland. It was a war of modern machines against a poorly equipped but determined enemy. Italian forces used tanks, aircraft, and heavy artillery. Most shockingly, they deployed chemical weapons, dropping poison gas on Ethiopian soldiers and civilians alike, an atrocity that shocked the world. Mussolini presented the war as Italy's moment of destiny. Propaganda hailed it as the rebirth of Roman glory, a crusade to bring civilization to Africa. Parades in Rome celebrated every Italian advance, while posters depicted il duce as a conqueror restoring national pride. For many Italians, the invasion was intoxicating. After years of humiliation and frustration, here was a victory that seemed to prove fascism's strength. Crowds cheered Mussolini as he proclaimed a new empire. In May 1936, Addis Ababa fell, and Mussolini declared King Victor Emmanuel III the Emperor of Ethiopia. Italy's African empire was born, but the conquest came at a terrible cost. Ethiopian civilians suffered massacres, starvation, and chemical attacks. Resistance continued long after Italy claimed victory, draining resources and staining Italy's reputation. Internationally, the invasion violated the League of Nations rules, branding Mussolini as an aggressor. Yet for Mussolini, it was the peak of his popularity. Italy, he declared, was finally a great power. But this triumph would push him further into isolation and into dangerous alliances. The conquest of Ethiopia brought Mussolini glory at home, but condemnation abroad. The invasion was a blatant violation of international law, and the League of Nations responded by imposing economic sanctions on Italy. Sanctions targeted exports such as coal, steel, and oil, vital resources for Mussolini's war machine. Ships carrying goods to Italy were turned away from ports, and Italy's economy began to feel the strain. But the sanctions were limited and inconsistent. Britain and France, fearful of pushing Mussolini into Hitler's arms, refused to cut off oil completely. This half-hearted response exposed the weakness of the League. Mussolini used the sanctions to his advantage. He portrayed Italy as a victim of international bullying, rallying the nation around the regime. Propaganda urged Italians to tighten their belts for the glory of empire. Slogans such as "We will break the chains of sanctions" filled posters and speeches. Housewives were told to donate gold wedding rings to the state in exchange for steel bands, a symbol of sacrifice for the nation. Despite the hardships, Mussolini's popularity soared. The sense of isolation only deepened fascist Italy's nationalism and hostility toward the plutocratic democracies of Britain and France. Many Italians believed that the world envied their success and sought to keep them weak. In reality, the sanctions pushed Mussolini closer to a dangerous ally, Adolf Hitler. While the League condemned Italy, Nazi Germany offered trade and diplomatic support. Mussolini, once cautious of Hitler, now began to see Germany as a partner against the democracies that shunned him. The Ethiopian War had given Mussolini his empire, but it had also cut him off from much of the international community. Italy was celebrated in fascist parades, but abroad it was condemned as an aggressor. Isolated and defiant, Mussolini turned away from Britain and France and toward Hitler. By 1936, Mussolini's invasion of Ethiopia had left Italy isolated from the democracies of Britain and France. Yet out of this isolation came a new and dangerous partnership, the Rome-Berlin axis. At first, Mussolini had viewed Adolf Hitler with suspicion. He considered Germany a rival, especially after Hitler's rise in 1933 and his rearmament of the Rhineland. Mussolini even opposed Germany's early attempts to expand into Austria, declaring Italy would defend Austrian independence. But by the mid-1930s, the world had changed. Sanctions after Ethiopia pushed Mussolini away from London and Paris, and Hitler's Germany was one of the few nations offering support. Shared interests brought the two dictators closer. Both regimes despised liberal democracy, both were driven by expansionist ambitions, and both relied on militarism and propaganda to maintain power. Most importantly, Mussolini realized that aligning with Hitler could secure Italy's place as a great power in Europe. In October 1936, Mussolini and Hitler formalized their friendship in an agreement that Mussolini proudly named the Rome-Berlin axis. It was more than a pact. It was the beginning of a partnership that would shape the course of World War II. Propaganda celebrated the alliance as the union of two strong modern nations. Posters depicted Italian and German soldiers standing side by side, flags intertwined. Mussolini declared that the Axis was a line around which Europe would revolve. To many Italians, this was proof that Italy was no longer a minor power but a central player on the world stage. Yet the alliance also marked a turning point. By embracing Hitler, Mussolini tied Italy's future to Germany's aggression. The partnership would lead to disastrous wars that Italy was unprepared to fight. But for the moment, Mussolini basked in the glow of newfound power, proud to stand beside the Führer as one of Europe's dictators. In 1936, civil war erupted in Spain between the democratically elected Republican government and the right-wing nationalist rebels led by General Francisco Franco. For Mussolini, the conflict was more than a foreign war. It was a chance to expand fascist influence and prove Italy's military strength. Mussolini immediately threw his support behind Franco. He saw the Spanish Civil War as part of a broader struggle, fascism and authoritarianism against socialism and communism. Alongside Hitler, who also backed Franco, Mussolini sent troops, aircraft, tanks, and weapons. Italy eventually deployed over 70,000 soldiers to Spain, making it the largest foreign contributor to the nationalist cause. Italian planes bombed Republican cities, Italian submarines patrolled Spanish waters, and Italian soldiers fought in key battles. Propaganda at home portrayed the war as a holy crusade against communism, presenting Italian soldiers as heroes defending Western civilization. But the war was costly. Italian forces suffered heavy casualties, and the financial burden strained Italy's already weak economy. Many Italians questioned why their sons were dying in Spain for another country's war. Still, Mussolini pressed on, convinced that victory would expand fascist influence across Europe. By 1939, Franco emerged victorious, establishing a dictatorship that would last for decades. Mussolini celebrated the outcome as a triumph for fascism, but the reality was mixed. While Italy had gained a friendly regime in Spain, the war had drained resources and exposed weaknesses in Italy's military. Soldiers complained of poor equipment, outdated tactics, and ineffective leadership. The Spanish Civil War was a rehearsal for the larger conflict to come. For Mussolini, it was both a victory and a warning, a glimpse of the cost of aligning Italy's fate with endless wars abroad. For many years, Mussolini had not shown open hostility toward Jews. In fact, some Italian Jews had even supported fascism in its early years, seeing it as a defense against socialism or chaos. But by the late 1930s, Under the influence of Nazi Germany and Mussolini's growing obsession with racial ideology, Fascist Italy turned against its Jewish citizens. In 1938, the regime issued the racial laws, a sweeping set of anti-Semitic decrees. Jews were banned from holding government jobs, serving in the military, or teaching in schools. Jewish students were expelled from universities. Intermarriage between Jews and non-Jews was prohibited. Jewish-owned businesses were targeted for closure or forced sale. Overnight, thousands of Italian Jews became second-class citizens in their own country. Propaganda flooded the nation with racist rhetoric. Newspapers published pseudo-scientific articles claiming Italians were of pure Aryan stock, while Jews were depicted as dangerous outsiders. Posters, pamphlets, and classroom lessons hammered these ideas into the public mind. Many Italians were shocked. Unlike in Germany, Italy's Jewish community was small, about 47,000 people, and had been deeply integrated into Italian society. Jews had fought in World War I, contributed to the economy, and considered themselves fully Italian. But now, neighbors turned away, friends became silent, and families were forced into hiding. Mussolini justified the laws as necessary for Italy's racial integrity. But behind the rhetoric lay politics. By aligning Italy's policies with Hitler's, Mussolini tightened the Rome-Berlin axis. He hoped to strengthen ties with Germany and secure Italy's place as a racial and imperial power. The racial laws marked a turning point. Fascism was no longer just authoritarian. It had embraced racism as a state principle. For Italian Jews, life became a nightmare of exclusion, humiliation, and fear. And when war came, these laws would pave the way for even darker tragedies. In September 1939, Germany invaded Poland, and World War II began. Britain and France declared war on Hitler, plunging Europe into another catastrophic conflict. For Mussolini, the moment was critical, but also perilous. Italy was militarily unprepared. Despite fascist propaganda boasting of strength, the army was poorly equipped, the navy outdated, and the air force limited. Years of costly adventures in Ethiopia and Spain had drained resources. Mussolini himself admitted privately that Italy would not be ready for major war until at least 1942. Yet Mussolini feared being left behind. If Germany won quickly, he worried Italy would miss its chance to share in the spoils. He wanted Italy to be at the table when borders were redrawn, when empires were divided. At first, he declared Italy would remain in a state of non-belligerence, not neutral, but not yet fighting. This gave him time to watch events unfold. As the months passed, Mussolini hesitated. Hitler urged him to join the war, but Mussolini calculated carefully. Italy had much to gain if the Allies collapsed quickly, but everything to lose if the war dragged on. Inside Italy, propaganda painted the conflict as a struggle between dying democracies and the rising powers of fascism and Nazism. But privately, many Italians were anxious. They remembered the horrors of World War I and feared being dragged into another disaster. By staying on the sidelines, Mussolini bought time, but his ambition would not let him remain cautious forever. He was determined that Italy must join the war, not as a minor power, but as a co-architect of the new world order. For now, Italy watched and waited, but Mussolini's moment of decision was fast approaching. The war that would define his fate, and Italy's, was only just beginning. By June 1940, the tide of war seemed to be turning in Hitler's favor. France was collapsing under the German blitzkrieg, and Britain stood isolated. Mussolini, who had hesitated for months, now made his fateful decision. Italy would enter the war. On June 10, 1940, Mussolini stood on the balcony of Palazzo Venezia in Rome and declared war on Britain and France. Crowds below roared with excitement, waving flags and chanting, "Deus, Deus, Deus." Mussolini promised them a new Roman Empire, forged by blood and steel. But behind the spectacle, Italy was disastrously unprepared. Its army lacked modern weapons, its air force was outdated, and its navy was undermanned. Generals knew the truth. Italy was not ready. Yet Mussolini believed the war would be short, that Germany's victories would quickly end the conflict, and Italy could snatch easy gains. Italian troops were sent into southern France, but by the time they advanced, German forces had already secured victory. The campaign was brief and inglorious, exposing Italy as a junior partner to Hitler's Germany. Still, Mussolini pressed on. He hoped to claim colonies in Africa and territory in the Mediterranean. Propaganda boasted of victories that never materialized. Italian citizens, initially swept up in patriotic fervor, soon began to feel the weight of war, rationing, bombings, and the loss of loved ones. Mussolini had gambled everything on war. For the moment, it seemed like a triumph of willpower. But soon, reality would expose the weakness of fascist Italy. Confident in Germany's victories, Mussolini decided to prove Italy's strength with his own conquest. In October 1940, he launched an invasion of Greece from occupied Albania. He boasted that Italy would win in weeks, without German help. The reality was humiliation. Italian troops, ill-equipped and poorly supplied, faced fierce Greek resistance in the mountains. Instead of quick victory, the campaign turned into a disaster. Greek soldiers pushed the Italians back into Albania, inflicting heavy losses. Snow, mud, and rugged terrain made conditions miserable. Morale collapsed as Italian soldiers froze, starved, and died far from home. Mussolini was enraged. He had hoped to impress Hitler with a swift conquest, but instead, he exposed Italy's weakness. In April 1941, Hitler intervened, sending German troops to rescue the Italians and occupy Greece. The victory belonged to Germany, not Italy. At home, propaganda tried to mask the failure, but Italians knew the truth. Families received endless letters of casualties, and soldiers returning from the front spoke bitterly of poor leadership and lack of supplies. For many, the war no longer looked glorious, it looked hopeless. The Greek disaster was a turning point. It revealed Italy's military weakness, strained relations with Germany, and deepened discontent at home. Mussolini's dream of empire now looked like a nightmare. Instead of being a partner to Hitler, he had become dependent on him. The parallel war Mussolini dreamed of had ended in humiliation. From now on, Italy's war would follow Germany's lead, and Italy would pay the price. While Italian troops struggled in Greece, another front opened in North Africa. Mussolini dreamed of conquering Egypt, linking Italy's colonies in Libya and East Africa into one vast empire. In September 1940, Italian forces advanced from Libya into Egypt, confident of an easy victory against British troops. But the campaign quickly unraveled. Poorly equipped and led, Italian divisions stalled in the desert. British counterattacks shattered them, capturing tens of thousands of Italian prisoners. Mussolini's boast of a desert empire collapsed into humiliation. To salvage the situation, Hitler sent German reinforcements under the command of General Erwin Rommel, the Desert Fox. The arrival of the Afrika Korps turned the tide temporarily. Rommel's daring tactics won dramatic victories, pushing the British back across the sands. Italian propaganda celebrated these successes as proof of fascist glory, but in truth, Italy was dependent on German strength. For Italian soldiers, the Desert War was brutal. Supplies ran short, vehicles broke down, and the harsh climate killed as many as bullets. Morale sank as they realized they were fighting not for victory, but to prop up Mussolini's failing ambitions. By 1942, the momentum shifted again. At the Battle of El Alamein, British and Commonwealth forces halted the Axis advance. Soon after, American troops landed in North Africa, overwhelming the exhausted Italian and German armies. In May 1943, the Axis surrendered in Tunisia. Over 100,000 Italian soldiers were taken prisoner. The defeat was catastrophic. Mussolini's dream of an African empire was gone forever. Italy had lost prestige, resources, and countless lives. Ordinary Italians, already weary of the war, now began to doubt Mussolini's promises of glory. The North African disaster exposed fascism's hollow boasts and accelerated Italy's decline. By 1943, Italy's war effort was collapsing. After defeats in Greece and North Africa, the Allies turned their eyes to Europe itself. The first step was Sicily. On July 9, 1943, Allied forces, American, British and Canadian troops, launched Operation Husky, the largest amphibious invasion in history up to that time. Under cover of darkness, thousands of ships crossed the Mediterranean, landing tens of thousands of soldiers on the beaches of Sicily. Italian defenses crumbled almost immediately. Many soldiers, poorly supplied and disillusioned, surrendered without a fight. German troops fought fiercely, but even they could not stop the Allied advance. Within weeks, the Allies pushed across the island, capturing city after city. For ordinary Sicilians, the invasion brought chaos, but also hope. Bombings destroyed homes and killed civilians. But Allied troops were often welcomed as liberators. In villages, locals offered food and water to advancing soldiers, whispering that Mussolini's time was over. Back in Rome, panic spread. Mussolini's aura of invincibility had shattered. Even his closest allies began to plot against him. The fascist Grand Council, once loyal, whispered about removing Il Duce to save the nation from complete destruction. By late July, the Allies captured Palermo and prepared to push toward mainland Italy. On July 25, 1943, as the invasion advanced, Mussolini was summoned by King Victor Emmanuel III. Instead of rallying his regime, he was dismissed from power and arrested. The invasion of Sicily was not just a military victory. It was the beginning of fascism's collapse. Mussolini's empire had crumbled, and Italy stood at the brink of civil war. By the summer of 1943, Mussolini's regime was collapsing under the weight of defeat. The invasion of Sicily had shattered the myth of fascist invincibility. Allied bombs rained on Italian cities, families starved under rationing, and soldiers deserted in droves. Inside the fascist leadership, whispers of betrayal grew louder. On July 24, 1943, Mussolini convened a meeting of the Fascist Grand Council, the highest body of the regime. He expected loyalty, but instead, he faced rebellion. Senior fascist officials, once his most trusted allies, had concluded that Il Duce had become a liability. Among them was Dino Grandi, a veteran fascist who now led the opposition. Grandi introduced a motion calling for the restoration of power to the king and parliament, effectively stripping Mussolini of his authority. The debate raged through the night. Mussolini defended himself with fiery words, insisting Italy could still win the war. But one by one, his supporters turned against him. When the vote was taken in the early hours of July 25, the council sided with Grandi. Mussolini had been betrayed by his own party. The next day, Mussolini went to meet King Victor Emmanuel III, expecting to discuss the war. Instead, the king dismissed him and ordered his arrest. As Mussolini left the palace, he was taken into custody by carabinieri officers. Italy erupted in celebration. Crowds tore down fascist symbols, shouting that the dictatorship was over. For a moment it seemed that Italy had been freed, but the war was far from over, and Mussolini's story was not finished. Mussolini's fall in July 1943 seemed final. He was imprisoned in a remote mountain resort, cut off from the world. But Adolf Hitler refused to let his ally vanish. For Hitler, Mussolini was still valuable, a puppet to keep Italy under Axis control. In September 1943, German commandos launched a daring raid to rescue Mussolini from captivity at the Gran Sasso mountain. Led by Otto Skorzeny, they swooped in on gliders, overwhelming the guards without firing a shot. Mussolini, pale and shaken, was flown to Germany, where Hitler welcomed him warmly. Soon after, Mussolini was installed as the head of a new regime, the Italian Social Republic, RSI, based in the northern town of Salo. Officially, Mussolini was once again Il Duce, ruling a fascist state. In reality, he was a prisoner of Hitler, his power hollow, his authority propped up by German guns. The RSI was brutal and repressive. It relied on Nazi forces to maintain control and turned violently against its enemies. Jews were hunted and deported to concentration camps. Partisans, Italians who resisted the German occupation, were tortured and executed. Civil war raged as Italians fought, Italians, tearing the country apart. Mussolini himself was a shadow of his former self, tired, ill, and increasingly bitter. He admitted privately that his dream of empire was dead. Yet he continued to serve as Hitler's puppet, delivering speeches and issuing decrees that few respected. For ordinary Italians, the RSI was a nightmare. Cities in the north suffered bombings, food shortages, and Nazi brutality. The dream of fascism had ended in blood and ruin. The Italian Social Republic was Mussolini's last act, a grim epilogue to 2 decades of dictatorship. It was not a rebirth of fascism but its final, desperate gasp. By late 1943, Italy was split in two. In the south, the king and the new government had surrendered to the Allies. In the north, Mussolini ruled the Italian Social Republic (RSI) under Nazi control. Between them, a bloody conflict erupted, civil war. Italian partisans, workers, peasants, students, and former soldiers rose in arms against fascism and German occupation. They fought from the mountains and forests, using guerrilla tactics to ambush convoys, sabotage railroads, and assassinate officials. Their movement grew rapidly, fueled by anger at fascist brutality and Nazi repression. The RSI and German forces responded with savage reprisals. Villages suspected of aiding partisans were burned to the ground. Civilians were rounded up and shot in mass executions. Jews were hunted, deported, and sent to concentration camps. Fear ruled the countryside, but resistance refused to die. Families were torn apart. Brothers fought on opposite sides, some loyal to fascism, others joining the partisans. Communities lived in constant tension, caught between occupation forces and underground fighters. The war was no longer just Italy against foreign powers, it was Italians against Italians. Mussolini himself played little real role. He remained in Salo, issuing decrees and speeches, but his power was hollow. The true masters of northern Italy were the Nazis, yet the RSI's forces fought with ruthless loyalty, determined to uphold fascism until the bitter end. For ordinary Italians, life became unbearable. Food was scarce, cities were bombed, and violence was everywhere. But the partisan struggle grew stronger, inspired by the belief that they were fighting not only against tyranny, but for the rebirth of a free Italy. The Civil War would claim tens of thousands of lives. It was one of the darkest chapters in Italian history, but also one of courage. From the ashes of this brutal conflict, a new Italy would eventually emerge. By April 1945, the Axis was collapsing. Allied forces were advancing through northern Italy, and German control was crumbling. The Italian partisans intensified their uprising, determined to end fascism once and for all. For Mussolini, time had run out. On April 25, 1945, Mussolini fled Milan with his mistress Clara Petacci and a convoy of fascist officials. Disguised in a German uniform, he hoped to escape north into Switzerland and from there to Germany. But at Lake Como, partisans intercepted the convoy. Recognizing Il Duce, the fighters arrested him. Mussolini was no longer the proud dictator who once commanded millions. Witnesses described him as pale, exhausted, and silent, staring blankly as he was taken away. On April 28, Mussolini and Petacci were executed by firing squad in the village of Giuliano di Mezzegra. Their bodies were transported to Milan, where they were hung upside down at Piazzale Loreto, a grim symbol of fascism's end. Crowds gathered to jeer, spit, and throw stones at the corpse of the man who once claimed to be Italy's savior. For 20 years, Mussolini had dominated Italy through fear, propaganda, and violence. Now his fall was absolute. The Duce was gone, the fascist state destroyed, and Italy left in ruins. Yet his death was not just personal, it was symbolic. It marked the collapse of an ideology that had promised glory, but delivered only suffering, war, and death. Italy was free, but deeply scarred. The fall of Mussolini remains one of history's starkest lessons. No cult of power, no empire of lies, can endure forever. The death of Mussolini and the collapse of the fascist state in April 1945 marked the end of an era of dictatorship, war and suffering in Italy. But the fall of fascism did not bring immediate peace. It left behind devastation and division. Italy was shattered. Cities lay in ruins from years of Allied bombing. Industries were destroyed, railroads torn apart, and farmland abandoned. Millions were homeless, and food was scarce. Families mourned loved ones lost in battle, in prisons or to Nazi massacres. The scars of civil war ran deep, as Italians who had fought for fascism and those who had resisted now lived side by side, burdened by memories of betrayal and violence. Politically, Italy was at a crossroads. The monarchy, discredited for supporting Mussolini for 2 decades, faced growing opposition. In 1946, Italians voted in a referendum to abolish the monarchy, and Italy became a republic. King Victor Emmanuel III, the man who once gave Mussolini power, went into exile. The new republic sought to purge fascism from public life. Fascist officials were tried, banned from office or fled abroad, yet the shadows of fascism lingered. Some Italians still clung to the memory of Mussolini, while others struggled to rebuild a nation free from dictatorship. The resistance, made up of partisans who fought against fascism and Nazi occupation, became a powerful symbol of the new Italy. Their courage and sacrifice helped inspire a vision of democracy, freedom, and justice. But the wounds of war, massacres, reprisals, betrayals were slow to heal. Internationally, Italy's defeat was humiliating. The empire Mussolini promised had vanished, leaving the country weakened and dependent on Allied support. Yet this humiliation also gave Italy a chance for rebirth. In the years ahead, Italy would rebuild, guided not by fascist dreams of empire, but by the hard lessons of war and dictatorship. The aftermath of fascism was a time of suffering, but also of hope. From the ruins, Italians began to imagine a future built on liberty, not tyranny. The rise and fall of fascism in Italy remains one of history's most powerful warnings. Mussolini had promised glory, unity, and strength. Instead, he delivered dictatorship, oppression, and war that left Italy in ruins. His story offers lessons that echo far beyond his own time. Fascism thrived on fear and division. It rose in a time of crisis, economic hardship, social unrest, and disillusionment with democracy. Mussolini exploited anger and uncertainty, offering simple answers to complex problems. His charisma, propaganda, and violence silenced opposition until it was too late. The lesson is clear: democracy must never be taken for granted. When citizens abandon freedom for promises of strength, they risk losing both. The cult of personality around Mussolini showed how dangerous it is to place absolute trust in one man. Another lesson lies in the cost of war. Mussolini's reckless ambition for empire dragged Italy into conflicts it could not win, causing devastation at home and abroad. His alliances with Hitler and Nazi Germany revealed the peril of tying a nation's future to tyranny and aggression. Yet the fall of fascism also offers hope. Ordinary Italians, through the resistance, proved that courage and sacrifice can defeat oppression. From their struggle, Italy was reborn as a republic founded on democracy and freedom. The legacy of Mussolini is not only a story of dictatorship, but a reminder of resilience. It warns us of how easily liberty can be lost, but also how it can be regained through the determination of those who refuse to bow to tyranny. As we reflect on Mussolini's Italy, we are reminded that history is not distant. The same forces of fear, division, and authoritarianism can rise again if vigilance is lost. The greatest lesson of fascism is not only to remember the past, but to ensure it is never repeated. As we reach the end of this journey through the rise and fall of fascism in Italy, we are reminded of the fragility of freedom and the heavy cost when it is lost. For 2 decades, Mussolini promised his people greatness. He promised order, power, and empire. Instead, he delivered fear, oppression, war, and ruin. His story is not just about one man, it is about a nation that surrendered liberty for the illusion of strength. Yet from the ashes of fascism came something greater. Ordinary Italians, scarred by dictatorship and war, rose again to reclaim their voice. The partisans who fought in the hills, the families who endured bombings, the citizens who rebuilt their shattered cities, they gave birth to a new Italy, one built on democracy and freedom. The legacy of Mussolini is a warning etched in history. When we silence dissent, when we exalt leaders as infallible, when fear triumphs over reason, we walk the same dark road. But it is also a call to courage, a reminder that tyranny can be defeated, and that liberty, once reclaimed, shines brighter than before. The past speaks to us still. Let us listen, so we never repeat it.